Well, we've been going through now for a number of weeks a series focused on the Old Testament called For God and Country. You might see it written out for you in the back of your bulletin. For God and Country. And the focus has been in the Old Testament, in the book of Jeremiah, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. And if you actually count the words and figure it out, the book of Jeremiah is actually the longest book in the entire Bible. And so we get to know a whole lot more about Jeremiah than all of the other prophets. We get a whole lot more of his words and his life and the things he encountered and his experiences with God. And so Jeremiah becomes a very big figure. And even to the point that when people saw Jesus and they were speculating, who is this guy and what is he doing and what's his message? And one of the things that came to mind was that maybe he's Jeremiah come back. And so that's the kind of things that Jeremiah was associated with, such that it carried on. And when they saw Jesus, they thought of Jeremiah. And so that was quite a big impact. And so when we're looking at the book of Jeremiah, we're looking at one thing the other week that kind of just really stands out. And if you don't get anything else, get this: that God delights in showing mercy. That God delights in showing mercy. It gives God joy to show mercy to people, to just lift them up and to help them. God delights in showing mercy. And we saw how Jeremiah was interacting with the people and trying to get them to turn back to God. And God gave Jeremiah this one errand. He says, look, Jeremiah, I want you to understand how bad it is in Jerusalem, in this land. I want you to understand. He says, here's what I want you to do. Find one person, Jeremiah. One person who's trying to follow me. One person who's trying to be faithful. Just find one. And I will save Jerusalem. All the bad things that I told you could come, they're not going to come. The invasion's not going to come. You're not going to go into exile. I'll protect the city if you find me one person. Jeremiah couldn't. And then last week we talked about how, further demonstrating God's great love of wanting to show mercy, he tells Jeremiah, he says, look, give this message to the people. One commandment. I'm going to pull one commandment. Follow me in this one commandment. You know how many commandments? There's 600. You wrap them all up. But he pulls one of the 10 commandments. Just one. We get our minds all bogged down with all the commandments of God and the rituals and all this kind of stuff. God boils it down to one. He says, give me something to work with. Show me you'll cooperate. Show me that there's something in you that wants to obey and know me. And he says, follow this one commandment. He says, and I'll make Jerusalem always have a king from David on the throne. You follow this one commandment, and I will, protect the city. Remember what commandment that was? Keeping the Sabbath. Yeah, he says one. One commandment. The people weren't interested. They said, we're fine the way we are. We don't believe your message, Jeremiah. We got the temple. We got the priests. We do the little sacrifices. We're good. God delights in showing mercy. And so last week, we came to that point where the tide shifts. And it goes from warning and warning and warning to the tide is shifting. God's going to allow the invasion. You're not turning back. You've made this land as evil as it was when the Canaanites lived here. You're sacrificing your children, your little boys and girls. You're putting them into fire for these false gods. Who are you, Israel? I don't know you anymore. The tide's changed. So Jeremiah, last week we saw how God has him take the group of priests and elders, the leaders, and he takes them outside the city, and he has this big earthen pot, and he breaks it in front of them. We're like, well, what is this all about? And he says, just as this is broken and unrepairable, that's what God's going to do to Jerusalem. The tide has changed. Time's up. It's happened. Well, there was an overseer priest, one of the higher-ups, who heard about this, named Pashur. Remember what he did to Jeremiah?
Hung him up out there.
What's that?
The gate. Put him out there at the gate. Didn't they hang him up out there at the gates or something like that?
Well, that was part of it. What else? He arrests him, basically. He puts him in what we would call it, think of as stocks, you know, that kind of thing, like what Dennis is describing. And he has him whipped for saying that. He has him beaten. And so a lot of the discussion last week kind of just flowed from that about how, you know, sometimes you living out your faith is going to invite conflict. You shouldn't be surprised by this. This should not shock you. That at some point it rubs somebody in your family wrong. At some point it rubs somebody at your workplace wrong. At some point it rubs your neighbors wrong. At some point it's going to cause conflict. As one pastor I heard say years ago, he said, you should expect conflict. He says, and if you don't see any, ever, he says, it's one of two things. Either they don't know what you believe, or they haven't heard you. You haven't either told them, or they haven't heard you. Because it will invite conflict at some point. And so you got to deal with that. You got to deal with that. Well, moving forward, this week, I wanted to ask you a question. You know, and maybe you had it asked of you like this. Just kind of let me know if you have. Has anybody ever said, I've got good news and I've got bad news? Which do you want to hear first? Has anybody ever asked you that?
Yes.
Sound familiar? You know, they say, I got good news and I got bad news. Which do you want to hear first? Or what do you choose? You choose the good news or the bad news? How do you answer that? You want to hear the good first?
I want to hear the bad.
You want to hear
out what to get it over with.
Okay, find out what's bad and see if you can get it over with. How many would want to hear the good news first? Mike, you're in the minority. Why would you want to hear the good news first?
Stay positive. Maybe the bad won't be that bad, I guess.
Okay. Were you thinking the same thing, Sam? Yeah. Okay. So, you know, sometimes we get that put to it that way. You know, you got the good news, you got the bad news. What do you want to hear first? You know, sometimes that gets presented to us that way. I was thinking about a story, a baseball story about these two guys, and they both loved baseball. I mean, it was just so much of their passion. Since they were kids, they were best friends, and played baseball every weekend. They just loved baseball. And one of them ends up dying. And so after the funeral and everything, it's a very sad affair. But after the funeral that night, the other guy who survived, who was also, you know, the baseball fanatic, he has a dream where he meets the guy that had died, his friend. And he's in heaven. And he asks the guy, he says, you know, what is heaven like? And he goes, he says, I don't know how to describe it. He says, it's beyond anything I can imagine. He said, it's perfect. He says, it's just mind-blowing. He says, really? He says, you can't tell me? He says, I don't know how to explain it. And so he thinks about it for a second. He says, well, do they have baseball? And his friend says, well, I got good news and I got bad news. He says, the good news is there is baseball in heaven. He says, that's awesome. He said, well, what's the bad news? He says, you're starting pitcher next night. Didn't work didn't want to hear that he was quite ready to go yet. You know, it was that kind of thing. But you know, we get presented with that, the good news or the bad news, and sometimes we feel like, okay, that's good, and sometimes we feel like we'd rather hear the bad. Today we're going to focus on Jeremiah. Jeremiah is going to give them the good news and the bad news. And so that's our focus this morning. Bad news and good news from Jeremiah. The bad news and good news from Jeremiah. So we've got to kind of know Jeremiah a little bit and see kind of his experiences and his message to the people. Well, now we're going to get to this point. So we see the bad news and good news from Jeremiah. Say that with me this morning. The bad news and good news from Jeremiah. One more time. The bad news and the good news from Jeremiah. There's something that we can take away from it as well. You'll see how that intersects. So if you have your Bibles, or if you get to it on a phone or device or tablet, go with me to Jeremiah chapter 35. Jeremiah chapter 35. Jeremiah chapter 35. Jeremiah chapter 35, just to give you an idea about what's going on at this point, is that just like Jeremiah had told them by breaking that big piece of pottery in front of the leaders and the priests, that the tide had changed, that God is withdrawing his protection from Israel. Well, that started to happen. God has withdrawn his protection, and enemy armies, foreign armies, have moved into the region. Taking over pieces of the land and cities one by one. So this is starting to happen. And the people are on edge because they all know Jerusalem's got this big temple with lots of gold in it. And here we are. And these are big foreign armies. This is Babylon. This is the Arameans. These are big groups of foreign armies that are quite capable of doing whatever they want. And so that has begun to happen. People know that the invasion has begun and it's moving towards them. God has removed his protection. And so it says in verse 1, chapter 35, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah during the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. And he says, go to the Rechabite family and invite them to come to one of the side rooms of the house of the Lord and give them wine to drink. Now this must have seemed quite odd. You know, Jeremiah has been following God very faithfully. He's been doing exactly how God has been directing him about these different things, you know. And at one point he had to wear a yoke. And at one point, you know, he was breaking the pottery. And at another point he's doing this and that. You know, so God's had him doing a lot of different things to communicate to the people. In a very theatrical, dramatic, get your attention kind of way. And it ended up being dangerous. You know, that little incident with Pashur that, you know, Dennis helped us out with, that little incident with him, it got to be dangerous. There started to be conflict with Jeremiah's message. Well, here's the next message from God. You know, you can just see Jeremiah listening. You know, he hears the voice of God. He recognizes it. And he says, go to the Rechabite family. Okay, well, Rechabites, okay. That clan. Invite them to come to one of the side rooms of the house of the Lord. And give them wine to drink. You gotta think. Jeremiah's hearing that going, okay, this is very different. Is this a party? I mean, what's the occasion? I gotta buy wine? Whew, how much wine? How many Rechabites are there exactly? I gotta have this party with these guys? This does not sound like the usual kind of message from God. How much wine do I have to buy again? Do I wear my best sandals? You know, this is a very strange, different kind of message from God. But we know from past experience, Jeremiah is going to listen. Verse 3. And so I went to Jazaniah. There's a whole lot of these old Israelite names thrown in there. He says, Jeremiah, he says, I went to get Jazaniah, son of Jeremiah, the son of Habazaniah, and the whole family and sons and all of the Rechabites. Okay? So he's taking it seriously. He's doing it. He's finding this group, this big, huge, extended family known as the Rechabites. And he says, and I brought them into the house of the Lord, into the room of the sons of Hanan, son of Igdaliah, the man of God. And it was next to the room of the officials, which was over that of Messiah, son of Shallum, the doorkeeper. So he's giving you all the directions. He's done exactly what he did and where he took them and who's involved. He says, and then I set bowls full of wine and some cups before all the men of the Rechabite family and said to them, drink some wine. So he's got them all gathered at the right place. And he says, before we start this meeting, have a drink, guys. This must have seemed just as strange to them as it did to Jeremiah. But they replied, verse 6, we do not drink wine. So these guys are like, hold up. This isn't right. He says, we do not drink wine. He says, because our forefather Jonadab, son of Rechab, gave us this command. Neither you nor your descendants should ever drink wine. Also, you must not build houses, sow seed, plant vineyards. You must never have any of these things, but must always live in tents. And then you will live a long time in the land where you will be nomads. So did you catch that? Why are they refusing what Jeremiah has offered them freely at this big meeting? Why are they refusing? Did you catch it? Huh? Yeah. Yeah, because long ago, and if you look at the timeline in Scripture, if you try and figure it out, this happened about 250 years ago. So think about like the time of George Washington for us, about 250 years ago, right? This happened 250 years ago. That this forefather, long gone, right? This long gone forefather says, look, my family, my people, this is how we should live our life. This is what I think is best. He says, I don't want any of you drinking wine. If you're in my family, you don't need to touch this stuff. He says, I don't want anybody drinking wine. He says, and I want you to live as nomads. I don't want you to settle down. I don't want you to plant vineyards and gardens and all this kind of stuff. He says, you live in tents. You keep your distance from these big cities. Come to find out from a lot of scholarship, the Rechabites were probably metal workers. That they probably, set up their family tents in front of a good-sized city, would go into the city, get work to do, making things or repairing things from metal. Then after a period of time, they'd pick up all their tents and move to another city. Camp out outside that, and then go do their business that way.
Like gypsies.
Yeah, not too different. But to be nomads. And so they reject what God told Jeremiah to offer them. And Jeremiah's thinking, how much money did I spend on wine? What is this all about? This is quite a deal. Actually, he didn't say that, but you got to wonder about how he's thinking through this whole process. He says, this is verse 8, we have obeyed everything our forefather Jonadab, son of Rechab, commanded us. They said, we have kept that tradition going. Neither we nor our wives nor our sons and daughters have ever drunk wine or built houses to live in or had vineyards or crops. We have lived in tents and have fully obeyed everything our forefather Jonadab commanded us. They're saying we've always done it. We've always taken this tradition seriously. We built our lifestyle around it. He said it, and we respected and honored his wishes. We took him seriously. And so we made our lives that way. And then it says, but when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded this land, we said, come, we must go to Jerusalem and escape. And so we have remained nearby in Jerusalem. Then the word of the Lord, this is verse 12, came to Jeremiah, saying, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Now, Jeremiah, go and tell the men of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, will you not learn a lesson and obey my words? Jonadab, son of Rechab, ordered his sons not to drink wine, and the command has been kept. To this day, they do not drink wine because they obey their forefathers' command. But I have spoken to you again and again, and you have not obeyed me. See, he has the Rechabites to demonstrate something to the people of Judah and Jerusalem. He says, look at these guys. Their long gone forefather told them how to live. Said, you're my people, you're my family, and you should live this way. And he told them a few things that they should do. And they took him seriously. And they did it. And he says, look at my people. God says, I've brought you out of Egypt. I've saved you from slavery. I gave you a land. And when you strayed from me, I sent you prophets and prophets and prophets trying to get your attention and for you to take me seriously. But they didn't. He says, look at this. It's not like I'm asking you to do something superhuman. It's not like I'm asking you to do something you're not capable of. It's not like I'm asking too much. Just take me seriously. That's all God's asking. He delights in showing mercy. He's waiting for an opportunity to give you mercy. He says, look at the Rechabites. Some guy and their family, patriarch, long time ago, 250 years, said, do this. And they did it. But my people, after receiving from me again and again and again, shut up their ears. They don't want to take me seriously. The Rechabites were invited to this as a demonstration to Israel. That's part of the message of the bad news in all this. That's part of the bad news. Because the invasion's happening, just like Jeremiah said. God is removing his protection. The troops will come. The soldiers will camp out. Your city will be sieged. That's the bad news. And as he showed them from the Rechabite example, it was all avoidable. have to be this way. But it is. And that's what they chose. That's the bad news from this Rechabite example. But there's kind of a silver lining good news to understand as well. Because look, if the Rechabites, and that's God's example to the people, look, if they can show some kind of obedience to this forefather and their family for 250 years at this point, if they can do that and they can take these things seriously, who they are in this family, then you can take me seriously. That's the good news. God does not change. His message does not change. His love does not change. His delighting and showing mercy does not change. And so even then, as the troops are on the horizon, they can turn to God. Because God is still giving the messages through Jeremiah. Even now, they can turn to God. When they go into exile, they can take God seriously. And when they come back from exile, they can take God seriously. They can be people of faith. They can be like Noah. They can be like Abraham. They can be like Moses. They can be like Job. They could be like Jeremiah. These are not perfect men. These are not perfect people. But they took God seriously. And that's what he wants. Take me seriously. Show me you want to know me. Show me you want to follow me. Show me that you love me because I love you. And they can still do it. Starting that day, they could still do it. And going forward. Now, when we see this example, I think it's worth noting how that intersects with us. Because as Christians, you may go through a season, and it may be longer than a season, but you may go through a season where you don't take God seriously. He's just an add-on to your life. You don't honor him. You don't respect him. You don't take him seriously. As I heard one seminary professor describe it, we're like tipping God. You know, we just give him a little bit. Just a little bit, maybe 10%, maybe, want to be good tippers. Imagine the offensiveness of that to God. That we take our whole lives. He saved us for now and for eternity. We're just going to tip him a little. Give him a little bit of our time. Give him a little bit of our attention. Oh, give him a little bit of our finances. Just give him a little. Just tip him. We'll just keep him at arm's length. Just so he doesn't try and, upset our lives too much. Christians, too, can fall into that trap. And maybe it's being distracted or maybe it's something else. But we don't take God seriously. We don't take him seriously. When I was growing up and in classes in school or even in athletics, one thing my mom and dad just pushed into my brain, and maybe you kind of did the same thing or heard the same, do your best. That was a requirement, do your best. I know you're not going to get an A in calculus, but do your best. I know you're not going to get an A in chemistry, do your best. They didn't say that, but they said do your best. And I knew that if I put some effort, if I was serious, if I worked at it, if I had a commitment, and if I did my best, that's all they asked. We don't do that with God, do we? Do we do our best? We do our best for our employer, he might give us a raise. We do our best for our family, keeps the peace. Do we do our best for God? Do we take him seriously? Rechabites took that old man seriously years ago. Ordered their whole life around that. Do we take God seriously? You know, there's a reason why Paul and John goes back to it as well. They both kind of give you this idea of test yourself. Don't you get comfortable. Test yourself. Take God seriously. How are you doing? What's your condition? You know, and sometimes Christians, and we look at family members and friends or people around us, and, you know, and we get this way. We look at the whole situation that they're going through, and we go, you know, they've been away from church for so long, we just, you know, we wonder about them, and we want them to come back, and so we try to pray them back into church. Because they don't take God seriously. And we know they don't. Everything about their life will tell us they don't take God seriously. And so we try to pray them back to church. Oh, I remember when they came to church. Let's just pray them back to church. You need to pray them into the kingdom. Because that may be the issue. If they're not taking God seriously, you need to be praying that God opens their eyes and they let God save them. And then they'll take God seriously. Then you'll have to make room for them in the pew. Then they'll take God seriously. You need to be praying them to the kingdom. Then you won't have to worry about their church attendance or any of that other kind of stuff. You really won't. And the good news, how this intersects with us, is that this feels like a kick in the pants, or maybe like, you know, a little bit of heaping on guilt, or maybe shame. The only point of guilt is to turn you to God. That's it. Once it's done that, it's served its purpose. It should be no more in your life. So if this is kind of weighing heavy on you, if this message kind of stings, if it steps on your toes, and you go, you know, I'm not really taking God seriously. I just try to fit him in every once in a while. If that kind of feels that way, it's all about God's grace. Let him walk with you. Listen to his voice. He's a God of grace. He delights in showing mercy. And you're keeping him at arm's length. And you can't receive mercy when you do that. As the music plays this morning, let's understand the Rechabite example. Let us see who we really are. Let's look in a mirror. Let us see other people and circumstances the way God sees them. Let's respond.